that you should have noticed from your labs. Right around 1.5 to 2% salinity, there's a really big change in germination success. My hunch is most of you got good germination for 0, 0.5, 1. At around 1 or 1.5, you might have seen a dip in germination. And about 1.5 or 2, pretty much nothing will sprout. That's the point when you know the farm is messed up. When the water on the surface has about 1.5 or 2% salt, you got to do something. Usually what we do with salt is we just flush it out. You guys know where all the salt ends up, in the ocean. But if your salt gets stranded on a farm that's in a basin, or if you farm in an area with poor drainage, then you get an accumulation of salt, so when the surface gets wet, that water is too salty, and the seeds can't soak it up because of osmotic pressure. They're leaking water back to the salt around them, and so seeds don't sprout. There are some seeds that are just a little more salt hardened than others. So in places where the soil is naturally salty, like most deserts, desert plants tend to do pretty well with salty water. But all seeds have a salinity limit. For agricultural products, it's in the ballpark of 1.5 to 2.5, depending on the specific variety. The thing I wanted you to know about your soils, and it's kind of a bummer that you couldn't do a nutrient test.
No, I'm not.
You would not know, because we couldn't do nutrient testing. But usually there's a pretty direct correlation. Places that have more organic material on top will get more decomposed organic material in the soil. We call that humus. And when you have more humus in the soil, then you get more water retention. Soil is often darker. And you also get more nutrients. It's like the triple combo. Organic material on top improves water retention, improves nutrient content, and tends to give you darker soils. Now this lab was designed so that you could discover that yourself, but because the rats ate all of our nutrient test kits, we weren't able to do that important part of the lab, so you have to take my word for it. Some of you did end up with dark soils that did not retain water well. Those were probably very high in sand, because sand increases water throughput, while clay and silt increase water retention. Are there any questions about those soil labs, or are we ready to jump back into our furious frenzy of note-taking? Yes?
A couple years ago, we talked about how in the desert it creates that layer of salt, right? How do plants grow? And you said that's how plants grow, but if it's salt, then how can this grow?
Because it's sandy, you do get pretty good drainage. So technically, a lot of those roots will go below that salty layer, and the salt tends to stay kind of in that spongy stuff at the top where the evaporation happens first. All I can tell you is that those species are more well adapted to higher salt content. But even in the desert, if it's really high salt accumulation, you get increased germination. I think it's just a matter of adaptation, that being that those soils are naturally saltier, those species are more well adapted to that salt level. But even there's a point where you can overdo it with the salt. Okay. Shall we continue our furious note-taking frenzy?
clay and silt is lighter or darker?
Clay soils tend to be lighter in color.
And silt is?
Silt also. Yeah. These are all rough strokes. I'm sure you could find an exception to all of the rules here. Okay. Anybody know where we left off yesterday? 26. Say it again? 26. Cool. So I'm jumping straight to number 26. Actually, I'm skipping 26 and 27. So we did discuss fire renewal communities versus fire prevention policy.
Yeah.
Cool.
I think
We were on 28? Okay. So I think most of you got this out of the book. The diagram might look a little different, but this is the amount of notes that I have written down from the first time I went through your book. Remember, first of all, that clear cutting is the utter majority of logging globally. And by utter majority, I don't mean like 53%, I mean like 99.9%. Commercial logging is almost entirely clear cut. Now, in the United States, we've added some laws to limit the impact of clear cutting. For example, if you clear cut near a stream, you're supposed to leave a little buffer of forest along the streams to slow the erosion before it hits the river. But globally, almost all the logging, when somebody says that they're logging, it's almost always clear cutting. Because clear cutting is cheap, it's safe, and it's efficient. And that's how you get your profit. You don't want to do risky stuff because insurance is expensive, and paying life insurance is expensive, and retraining your staff is expensive. So safety is important, and low price is important. This is just straightforward. It's simple. Just cut down everything. Hurry up, and then we'll pick out what's useful. Unfortunately, the problems are also really obvious. The erosion, I'm sure you've heard about. It is total and absolute habitat loss because you've left no reservoir for wildlife. And there's very slow recovery. In some case, there's no recovery because if you've lost enough soil, the seeds can't resprout. And by the way, what seeds? There's no seeds to provide. There's no trees to drop seed. So this is the most profitable and the most ecologically devastating. If you spend time in NorCal, if you go visit Humboldt University or become a student there, you'll see like horizon to horizon clear cuts, and it's pretty depressing. It is just like taking a big rubber eraser and taking out an ecosystem. Strip and shelter wood cutting leaves some trees. You can either leave a row, like a strip of trees left, or just leave the handful of largest trees. And both of these are supposed to protect the soil, leave some habitat for the wildlife, and lower rates of erosion. Altogether, strip and shelter wood logging speed the recovery. The forest will come back much more quickly. But of course, you've lost some of your profit because the trees you left could have been your profit margin. So while strip and shelter wood logging are ecologically a little bit better, they're economically a little bit worse, and people generally don't do this unless they're forced to by law. Seed tree logging is basically a clear cut with a couple sticks in the middle, and the idea is to guide the diversity of the next forest. If I have mixed trees and I want to turn it into an oak forest, I leave some oak trees so that they can drop seeds and help me push the diversity toward oak trees in 30 or 50 years. This helps maintain local genetics, but basically it's just clear cutting with a couple sticks in the middle. Now, selective logging is to go through the forest and just pick out the one tree that has the characteristics you want or the other tree that has the characteristics you want. That's really difficult. You know, it's not easy to fell a tree in the middle of a forest and then get it out of there. Selective logging is, of course, the best ecological option of all the ones I've said so far, because, you know, the majority of the forest is there, the majority of the wildlife can remain, the majority of the soil is still protected, the majority of the genetics are still intact. So ecologically it's the best, but economically it's pretty much impossible. Unless those trees you target are extremely valuable, it's not worth it. Thinning, as you heard about yesterday, is to take out individual clumps within a forest. This is sort of the trade-off that a lot of national parks and national forests have made. Like, look, we protected this land, it's national land, but we can't afford to recreate patchiness using tax dollars, so we'll let the loggers come in and take out this little clump of redwoods, which are most economically valuable, because that'll leave behind a patch as if there had been a fire. Thinning is a trade. You tell the loggers, look, we need some more patchiness, so you can take out 1 out of every 20 acres, or something like that. Now, there is this propaganda battle between loggers and environmentalists. We hippie environmentalist types, we want to preserve intact forest. It's called old growth forest. And I've got to make a really important distinction, kids. Old growth forest is not old trees. You know what old growth forest means? Right, that's a forest that has not been logged. So there will be old trees, average trees, baby trees. Old growth does not mean old trees. It means ancient forest, that the ecosystem is intact. And old growth, ecologically speaking, is rare and priceless. Our state of California, with all of our environmentally left-leaning hippie politics, we've managed to protect about 2 or 3% of our original forest. The rest has either been logged or already sold to the logging companies, and they're just getting ready to go cut it down. Old growth forest is ecologically priceless. So environmentalists say, please don't cut the old growth. Of course, there's big old trees in there, including some rare lumber that's really expensive. So the logging companies say, you know, old growth, it's maxed out. It doesn't take in a lot of carbon because the trees aren't growing very fast. Why don't you let me get rid of that piece of crap old crusty forest for you? And we will plant 10 trees for every one that we cut. Those trees will have uninterrupted access to sunlight, and they'll grow quickly and they'll soak up carbon. This is better. And you know, that's kind of a mean-spirited propaganda thing. Because the carbon thing is a bad trade. There was a lot of carbon stored in those trees that they cut down. So sure, growing trees soak up more carbon, but that's because they're in an environment where there's no competition. They also will store less carbon for the next 100 years until they reach the same biomass as the original old growth. Also, you should understand that a tree farm is a monoculture just like these. So whether you have a monoculture of corn, or a monoculture of canola, or a monoculture of pine trees, plantation forests are still monoculture. No diversity, big magnet for disease, they overuse certain nutrients, and ecologically there's no diversity of habitat, there's no diversity of species, so it is ecologically not an ecosystem. If we're going to need logging, we should be cutting down tree farms and maintaining those areas as tree farms. If we're going to need logging, we should keep going with our existing plantations, but it's never a good trade to turn old growth into tree farms. Does that make sense to everyone? Anybody want to talk more about number 28? In this assignment, I have just a couple of study goals left, and this is just a few little drops of information. In number 30, remember that indirect deforestation is human activities that cause the loss of forest, but it's not logging, and it's not slash and burn agriculture. It's stuff that we do that coincidentally kills forest. So in the Industrial Revolution, all that burning of coal killed off a bunch of forest. That was indirect. It's not like we were burning coal because we had anything in our minds about the forest. It's just that the coal messed up the atmosphere, which hurt the trees. And back when your parents were in college, or maybe when they were in high school, there was a lot of concern about acid rain, because changes in the atmosphere were making rain more acidic, and that was coincidentally killing off forests everywhere. But for your generation, we've got a new problem for indirect deforestation. It's climate change. There's a really great example of how climate change kills off forest. If any of you know the Eastern Sierras, Mammoth Lakes area, June Lake, north of Bishop, how many of you go to the Eastern Sierras, Mammoth Lake zone? The next time you guys make that drive, keep your eyes open for big, tall pine trees that have all their pine needles, but all the pine needles are dead and brown. How many of you have seen a pine tree standing that's all dead and brown? If you haven't seen it yet, don't worry. They're becoming very common. I wish I had these statistics. If somebody can get me the right number, I'd be willing to pay extra credit for it. But I've heard that some states like Idaho, Colorado, Arizona, New Mexico, they're losing tremendous volume of pine forests. I don't want to exaggerate, but I think it was something like 50% in less than 20 years or something.
My uncle has a house in McCall in Idaho, and he was talking about how, I think he's even higher than that, how, because they super like 50 years in there, so they were talking about that.
Yeah, I wish I had better numbers to tell you about this, but entire acreage is dying off in a period of just a couple of years, and it's because of climate change, indirect deforestation. You drive cars and forest goes down. Think about indirect. And the issue in Idaho, you said?
Yeah.
The issue in Idaho, Nevada, Arizona, Colorado, the Sierras, is that with the planet getting a teeny little bit warmer, like 1 degree warmer over 100 years, that's not like, oh my God, I'm melting. But that rate of change shows up in weird ways. For example, nights below freezing get further apart. So, from spring until fall, you don't get any nights below freezing, right? You guys understand that? That after the winter is over, before the winter starts, every night is above freezing, right? When the planet gets a teeny bit warmer, instead of being, let's say, for the sake of conversation, instead of being 190 days between those frosts, it might be 200 days. By adding just a few more days between those last and first frost, you've added days on the steep part of the exponential growth curve for the population of beetles that carries a disease that kills the trees. I just packed a bunch of info in a sentence there. So there's these beetles that are not terribly common, but the beetle carries a disease. It's called pine pitch canker. It's a disease that travels through the sap of the trees. And you guys know how exponential growth works? At first, the growth is very, very slow, but at a certain point, it's called a J curve. Exponential growth starts to speed up. You guys understand this? Have you guys seen exponential growth? This is like Math 101, right? Have you all seen this already? So remember, the population of beetles, right when it's starting to take off, would get knocked back by the frost. But if we add like 10 more days on the tail end of that curve, the population of beetles gets to really spike. Those extra 10 days is a lot of extra beetles. Does that make sense? Because you're adding a couple days on the steep part of the curve so the population can really take off. And so because there's a little more space between the last frost of spring and the first frost of winter, populations of pine-boring beetles have been exploding at the end of summer, and they spread that disease that knocks back the trees. The disease has always been in the forest, but back in the day, it'd be like, hey, look, there's a dead tree, no big deal. And now, with a couple more days before the frost, the disease is showing up across the landscape. This is what we mean by climate change causing deforestation. It's not like the trees are spontaneously catching on fire because it's that hot. It's that little changes in rainfall, or little changes in permafrost duration, or little changes in disease transmission can really hammer forests. In some parts of the north, because the permafrost stays melted a little bit longer, trees basically swamp out and fall over. So in many parts of Alaska, literally, because permafrost is a smaller part of the year, trees are just more likely to fall over because they're sitting in mud instead of frozen dirt. And so in some parts of Alaska, because of climate change, the forests are just being blown over by wind. The number of trees falling to the wind has exploded because of climate change. Okay, first, second, third.
Oh, I had the numbers.
Oh, hit me.
It says white pine is 90% in 70 years, and then ponderosa pine is 40%. And 60% of that is accounted by this year alone.
Oh, this year alone? Where?
Pine beetles accounted for about 60% of all tree mortality last year.
Hot bang. Will you please email me this link? You have my email, right? Jack?
Can trees recover after they already get like the disease from the beetles?
Okay, so I had pine trees on my mountain property that died from this disease. And that was like the hot question, like, hey, can I do anything to save my trees?
I mean, like after the trees and the beetles die?
Basically, once the tree has enough holes in it, it bleeds out too much sap and it'll die. So it's like, once the tree has reached a certain point, there's no return. A little bit of beetle damage, trees can survive. But it's like a tipping point. Where like, I can get better from this, I can get better from this, and then no, it's too late. So with more beetles, there's more trees pushed beyond that tipping point. Overall tree mortality's gone way up because of the beetle damage.
He had much better than just all I could find is like the white pines and everything where it's increasingly pulling and the trunks were getting reducing half inches and everything was slowly.
Right. Yeah, there's other things about the rate of tree growth changing too, yeah.
80% moss in British
80% loss in British Columbia overall of life. Dang. These numbers may be slightly, I got to check these details, you know, but you can see that we are entering a really scary period for indirect deforestation. Back in the day, your parents were freaked out about acid rain. And nowadays, like, oh, it would be nice if that was our only problem. Any other questions about number 30? This class is such a downer, right? Like, didn't you get this, like, creeping feeling like we're all going the wrong direction right now? The canary in the coal mine is like, really dead, you guys. It's really dead. Okay. But don't freak out. It'll all work out. Just keep shopping. In number 31, I have an interesting story to tell you about conservation. But before I tell you that story about conservation, I want to talk a little tiny bit about wildlife. Do you guys know that many species are migratory, so they have a seasonal movement? They'll go to their winter feeding, or their winter breeding grounds and their summer feeding grounds or whatever. And here's another issue that I want you to keep in the back of your heads. There are grizzly bears up here, and there's a lot of grizzly bears right there, but there's not a lot of grizzly bears in the middle. Do you guys know what happens when two populations are genetically disconnected? That's right, genetic isolation and divergent evolution. They change independently because there's no gene exchange. Does that make sense to everybody? You've heard this already, right? It's like biology and stuff. Now comes my story. When the United States started to set aside wilderness for conservation, we saved the places that are, you know, really beautiful. So when you go to like Zion, Arches, Canyonlands, Grand Canyon, Glacier National Park, Yellowstone, Yosemite, those are like really pretty places. You get to the Lookout sponsored by Kodak, and it's like, oh, this is so pretty. It's an obvious priority for protection, right? Like whatever it costs, we got to make this a national park because that's a really nice spot. So when we started to set up our national forest and our national park, we looked across the United States and we said, that's a good spot, that's a good spot, that's a good spot. And we sort of circled the places that we really liked. Set them aside, and we promised for perpetuity that they would be preserved for the sake of the American people forever. But everything else we've developed. We've got freeways, strip mines, shopping centers, farms, cities, suburbs, dams, reservoirs. We've developed all over the landscape, except for those really beautiful spots that we saved. But you realize that wildlife doesn't really necessarily recognize that same beauty value. Wildlife, they need to keep their genetic continuity and they need to move around. What's funny is Yellowstone looks really nice to us, but to a lot of those wildlife, they're trapped. It's like a prison. A lot of the wildlife in Yosemite is like, great, I've got this little tiny island, but I really want to go over there because that's where all the hot chicks are, and I can't get there because there's a city in the way. Or, dang, I'm getting really hungry in Yellowstone. I wish I could go down to that meadow, but there's a farm in the way. So I got to give Patagonia credit for one thing, and only one thing. They had this really successful campaign to raise awareness about conservation corridors. It was called the Freedom to Roam campaign, and it really got the ball rolling to support conservation corridors, chunks of land that are not necessarily like, oh, but they're really valuable because they maintain genetic continuity between those little islands that we've protected. You know, like Yellowstone is great and Glacier National Park is great, but ecologically it's more important that we save that little strip of farms between those two islands, because that way animals can migrate and they can maintain a genetically continuous population. Conservation corridors are areas of land which connect singular wildlife populations to support migration and genetic continuity. Can I help anybody with that concept or any other parts of 4.3?
Is there any way you can repeat that?
You could watch the video. Yeah, I mean, I'm sorry that I ramble, but most of the time that I'm talking in these rush days, I'm A, in a rush, and B, it's probably noteworthy. Somebody else might have written it down. She was writing.
I'm telling you where.
See, he was helping. Okay. Anybody else?
If you want to hear it again, I was telling you what.
Anything else on 4.3? All right. So 4.4 was movie questions. And since you were all here and you all saw the movies and you would all have chosen whether or not you wanted to take notes, I don't need to repeat any content, but I do want to point out the stuff that I've highlighted in my notes. In number 33, we started to build this table. And you know, that's not a bad way to start the unit because we've really filled it in since then. So in number 33, if you were watching the movie, you put on this side pesticide, fertilizer, globalization, water use, machinery, monoculture. Sorry, on the red side. And then on the blue side, you probably put up integrated pest management, mulch, cover crop, dirt as an ecosystem, polyculture, crop rotation. The whole point of number 33 and of showing you that movie on the first day was to get you thinking about this setup, and then we spent the last 2 weeks sort of adding details. Study goal number 34 was about the Green Revolution. Remember that the Green Revolution was high-yield crops supported by more chemistry and more irrigation. And today in 2013, we sort of poo-poo all of that irrigation and all of those chemicals. But to give credit where credit is due, the Green Revolution did make much more food per person. In a period when population doubled, food production tripled because of the Green Revolution. So yes, that chemical interpretation of soil is sort of frowned upon today by hippies like me. But it did really do something about global starvation when it didn't seem like there was anything else we could do. In number 34, you also should have noticed a couple of really important terms. Pest resurgence, where you kill off all sorts of insects, but the really bad ones come back because you've left all their food out. And the pesticide treadmill, where you add pesticide, the bugs come back, so you got to add pesticide, and then the bugs come back, so you got to add pesticide. You know, like a treadmill where you do a lot of work and stay in the same place. Study goal 35 is a really well-known example about Australia. Number 36 was about the Sahel region of Africa, where they introduced alley cropping, like growing farms between rows of trees to protect the soil. And in the Sahel, the video also talked about low rock dams, like a speed bump, to slow runoff so more would soak into the ground. Number 37 was wrong in the video, so I skipped it. But you should know that today we grow about 50% of our seafood in aquaculture. We're right around 45 to 50. Every year I get confusing debates about that number. Growing salmon right next to the coastline has been really unpopular with environmentalists. And I'm assuming that you'll remember from the movie. Atlantic salmon can escape and breed with the Pacific. Disease can be easily transmitted because they're so packed and all the native salmon are going right by them. You might remember that Norway had to kill off entire watersheds of salmon to limit the spread of disease. And of course, you realize that it's not very efficient to eat carnivorous fish because you've got to feed them giant volumes of other seafood. So fish farming didn't really take any heat off the ocean. It actually created the need for more fishing to feed the fish farms. 38. China has done really well with a traditional method called carp polyculture. In number 39, you should definitely have that term, the polyculture of carp, different species of carp. Secret being that when you mix all those different species of carp, you've got some that eat the bugs, and some that eat the poop, and some that eat the vegetables, and some that eat the seaweed, or the freshwater algae. And so by having a variety of carp species, you get a lot more fish to eat with a lot less inputs into the system. And shellfish, OMG, they solve pretty much all the problems. They require no input. They're fast growing. They're filter feeders. So they usually clean the water and you don't have to feed them. And by the way, they're low on the food web, so we can get a lot of protein per acre. Shellfish, if more people could jump aboard the wagon, would be a really good way to get protein into more humans. There were other good alternatives like vegetarian fish and maybe deep sea farms, but I really need to lecture you about those couple of study goals that we didn't watch a movie for. You can just cross out number 45. That's an interesting environmental history issue that we won't have a chance to talk about. But we really got to talk about numbers 44 and 46. Luckily, the bells are a little bit out of rhythm, so we might be able to do this before the bell rings. If not, we'll start here tomorrow. This part of California looks really, really green, but you should know that that's a seasonal green. Especially down here, the Imperial Valley and the San Joaquin Valley. Some of those areas get less rainfall per year than the Sahara Desert. Not a lot of rainfall. But why does it look so green if it doesn't rain very much? It's a valley. You see, check it out. A perfect ring of mountains with a single outlet. Historically, in the flood season, the ocean would come all the way up to here. Sometimes you could get to Sacramento from San Francisco on a boat. I've seen photographs of Sacramento with water flooding up to the roofs of the houses. Turn of the century, like about 100 years ago. Because obviously this is on the jet stream. These mountains get a ton of water. This area stays pretty dry, and then these mountains get a ton of water and snow. So in the spring, when that snow melts, it all just flushes into these valleys. Now in those valleys, you get...
You get that in the valleys?
Yeah, you get a lot of that in the valleys. Thank you, kids. I'm sorry about...